Good afternoon. My name is Michael Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. Thank you all for joining us for this critical and important conversation today.
Now, it is my honor to introduce to you a man who needs no introduction. He is the founder of the My Brother's Keepers program. He is a father, lawyer, lecturer, community organizer, and so much more. Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, he is the man who changed America forever. It is none other than the 44th president of the United States of America, President Barack Obama.
Man, thank you. Man, that was unbelievable. And we could not be prouder. And you are a hard act to follow. So, I can't wait to see all the great things that you're going to be doing in the future. Good afternoon, everybody. All the participants, all the panelists. Let me start by just acknowledging that we have seen in the last several weeks, last few months, the kinds of epic changes and events in our country that are as profound as anything that I've seen in my lifetime. And I'm now a lot older than planned. I'm going to be 59 soon. And let me begin by acknowledging that although all of us have been feeling pain, uncertainty, disruption, some folks have been feeling it more than others. Most of all, the pain that's been experienced by the families of George and Brianna and Ahmad and Tony and Sean and too many others to mention, those that we thought about during that moment of silence. And to those families who've been directly affected by tragedy, please know that Michelle and I and the nation grieve with you, hold you in our prayers. We're committed to the fight of creating a more just nation in memory of your sons and daughters. And we can't forget that even as we're confronting the particular acts of violence that led to those losses, our nation and the world is still in the midst of a global pandemic that's exposed the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system, but also the disparate treatment and, as a consequence, the disparate impact that exists in our healthcare system, the unequal investment, the biases that have led to a disproportionate number of infections and loss of life in communities of color. So in a lot of ways, what has happened over the last several weeks is challenges and structural problems here in the United States have been thrown into high relief. They're the outcomes not just of the immediate moments in time, but they're the result of a long history of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and institutionalized racism that too often have been the plague, this original sin of our society. And in some ways, as tragic as these past few weeks have been, as difficult and scary and uncertain as they've been, they've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change America and make it live up to its highest ideals. And part of what's made me so hopeful is the fact that so many young people have been galvanized and activated and motivated and mobilized. Because historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people. Dr. King was a young man when he got involved. Cesar Chavez was a young man. Malcolm X was a young man. The leaders of the feminist movement were young people. Leaders of union movements were young people. The leaders of the environmental movement in this country and the movement to make sure that the LGBT community finally had a voice and was represented were young people. And so when sometimes I feel despair, I just see what's happening with young people all across the country and the talent and the voice and the sophistication that they're displaying. And it makes me feel optimistic. It makes me feel as if, you know, this country is going to get better. Now, I want to speak directly to the young men and women of color in this country who, as Playon just so eloquently described, have witnessed too much violence and too much death. And too often, some of that violence has come from folks who were supposed to be serving and protecting you. I want you to know that you matter. I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter. And when I go home and I look at the faces of my daughters, Sasha and Malia, and I look at my nephews and nieces, I see limitless potential that deserves to flourish and thrive. And you should be able to learn and make mistakes and live a life of joy without having to worry about what's going to happen when you walk to the store or go for a jog or are driving down the street or looking at some birds in a park. And so I hope that you also feel hopeful, even as you may feel angry, because you have the power to make things better, and you have helped to make the entire country feel as if this is something that's got to change. You've communicated a sense of urgency that is as powerful and as transformative as anything that I've seen in recent years. I want to acknowledge the folks in law enforcement that share the goals of reimagining policing, because there are folks out there who took the oath to serve your communities and your countries, have a tough job, and I know you're just as outraged about the tragedies in recent weeks as are many of the protesters. And so we're grateful for the vast majority of you who protect and serve. I've been heartened to see those in law enforcement who've recognized, let me march along with these protesters. Let me stand side by side and recognize that I want to be part of the solution. And who've shown restraint and volunteered and engaged and listened, because you're a vital part of the conversation. And change is going to require everybody's participation. Now, when I was in office, as was mentioned, I created a task force on 21st century policing in the wake of the tragic killing of Michael Brown. That task force, which included law enforcement and community leaders and activists, was charged to develop a very specific set of recommendations to strengthen public trust and foster better working relationships between law enforcement and communities that they're supposed to protect, even as they're continuing to promote effective crime reduction. And that report showcased a range of solutions and strategies that were proven and that were based on data and research to improve community policing and collect better data and reporting and identify and do something about implicit bias in how police were trained and reforms to use the force that police deploy in ways that increase safety rather than precipitate tragedy. And that report demonstrated something that's critical for us today. Most of the reforms that are needed to prevent the type of violence and injustices that we've seen take place at the local level. Now, reform has to take place in more than 19,000 American municipalities, more than 18,000 local enforcement jurisdictions. And so as activists and everyday citizens raise their voices, we need to be clear about where change is going to happen and how we can bring about that change. It is mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. And that determines police practices in local communities. It's district attorneys and state's attorneys that decide typically whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct. And those are all elected positions. And in some places, they're police community review boards with the power to monitor police conduct. Those oftentimes may be elected as well. The bottom line is, I've been hearing a little bit of chatter in the internet about voting versus protest, politics and participation versus civil disobedience and direct action. This is not a either or. This is a both and. To bring about real change, we both have to highlight a problem and make people in power uncomfortable, but we also have to translate that into practical solutions and laws that can be implemented and we can monitor and make sure we're following up on. So, very quickly, let me just close with a couple of specific things. What can we do? Number one, we know there are specific evidence-based reforms that, if we put in place today, would build trust, save lives, would not show an increase in crime. Those are included in the 21st Century Policing Task Force report. You can find it on obama.org. Number two, a lot of mayors and local elected officials read and supported the task force report, but then there wasn't enough follow-through. So today I am urging every mayor in this country to review your use of force policies with members of your community and commit to report on planned reforms. What are the specific steps you can take? And I should add, by the way, that the original task force report was done several years ago. Since that time, we've actually collected data, in part because we implemented some of these reform ideas. So we now have more information and more data as to what works. And there are organizations like Campaign Zero and Color of Change and others that are out there highlighting what the data shows, what works, what doesn't in terms of reducing incidents of police misconduct and violence. Let's go ahead and start implementing those. So we need mayors, county executives, others who are in positions of power to say, this is a priority. This is a specific response. Number three, every city in this country should be a My Brother's Keeper community, because we have 250 cities, counties, tribal nations who are working to reduce the barriers and expand opportunity for boys and young men of color through programs and policy reforms and public-private partnerships. So go to our website, get working with that, because it can make a difference. And let me just close by saying this. I've heard some people say that you have a pandemic, then you have these protests. This reminds people of the 60s and the chaos and the discord and distrust throughout the country. I have to tell you, although I was very young when you had riots and protests and assassinations and discord back in the 60s, I know enough about that history to say there is something different here. You look at those protests, and that was a far more representative cross-section of America out on the streets, peacefully protesting, and who felt moved to do something because of the injustices that they had seen. That didn't exist back in the 1960s, that kind of broad coalition. The fact that recent surveys have showed that despite some protests having then been marred by the actions of some, a tiny minority that engaged in violence, that despite, as usual, that got a lot of attention, a lot of focus, despite all that, a majority of Americans still think those protests were justified. That wouldn't have existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. there is a change in mindset that's taking place, a greater recognition that we can do better. And that is not as a consequence of speeches by politicians. That's not the result of, spotlights in news articles. That's a direct result of the activities and organizing and mobilization and engagement of so many young people across the country who put themselves out on the line to make a difference. And so I just have to say thank you to them and for helping to bring about this moment, and just make sure that we now follow through. Because at some point, attention moves away. At some point, protests start to dwindle in size. And it's very important for us to take the momentum that has been created as a society, as a country, and say, let's use this to finally have an impact. All right. Thank you, everybody. Proud of you guys. And I know that we're going to be hearing from a bunch of people who have been on the front lines on this and know a lot more than I do about it. Proud of you.
Thank you, Mr. President. For everyone that's watching, the president decided he wanted to stay and be a part of the conversation that's going to be led by Brittany Pecknett Cunningham with the Attorney General and other leaders.
Taught us
before we go,
that protest is actually what creates the pressure so that the policy can get passed. Similarly, we are in a long-term game and a short-term game here. That while we are dealing with radical imagination and reimagining what public safety can look like, even beyond police in our communities, we also have to make sure that people are safe now. In your role as Attorney General, you did a lot of that work in addressing people's safety right now. So can you tell us what you learned that was instructive for this moment, particularly as you engaged in pattern and practice investigations and consent decrees if situations like this happened in communities and once we saw the kind of uprisings that we did all over the country when you were still in office?
Well, I think one of the key things that people have to understand is that there's not a tension between justice and having fair treatment and public safety. You can keep people safe and also have a better, more equitable criminal justice system.
Overall, we have to get serious about investing in new alternative systems of public safety that are rooted in justice and our community.
That means we need justice. And as Dr. Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. So let's go make sure that love is living out loud in public. Mr. President, I see your face. I've seen that face many times before in our meetings. I know you are itching to ask a question. So I will close and hand it off to you.
Well, listen, I've just been enjoying, hearing all the wisdom that's been spread by so many others. I want to first of all give Eric Holder his props as Attorney General. He rebuilt a civil rights division within the Justice Department and was consistently on the ground, working with communities, listening to communities, and coming up with practical solutions to try to make things better. And I couldn't be prouder of him. Blown away by Philippe and all the good work that he's doing. Rashad has been a consistent warrior for change. He was part of the conversations we had after Ferguson. And Brittany, I think you're all that. So as I listen, I am feeling once again inspired. And what has particularly inspired me is the degree to which folks are thinking strategically, practically, at a very detailed level about where are the places where you can make change and what are the practical solutions backed up by research, backed up by data, backed up by experience that allows us to create a set of communities that are safe and just, safe and fair, safe and non-discriminatory, and that is possible. And I think that one of the things that has been raised is the fact that we don't have the capacity to eradicate 400 years of racism in one fell swoop. So if we think that this is a seismic shift, I hope people don't feel like, well, nothing's going to happen once we figure this out. As I've been known to quote Dr. King, I've said frequently, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We bend it. All of you have bent it over the last 4, 5, 6, 10 years. And we are seeing the fruits of those labors in the degree of awareness that is out there. Look, think about some of the people who have unequivocally spoken out against what happened in Minneapolis. I mean, you have, I just saw Jim Harbaugh, sorry, I know we got, the Ohio State contingent here, but you got Jim Harbaugh, the coach of Michigan football, marching today. That's not something that was happening 5, 6 years ago, although Jim, I know, and he's been on the right side of this issue for quite some time. You have unlikely participants because all of you have worked so hard to raise awareness. That's the progress that has been made. It doesn't mean everything's been solved. The only question I think maybe might be worthwhile for me to throw out there, even though I've read enough of the literature to have a pretty good sense of what the answer is going to be. Brittany, you mentioned that Campaign Zero has put forward 8 Can't Wait. We've talked about the 21st Century Task Force report. It'd be useful maybe to just tick off very quickly. What are the 8 things that are the 8 that Campaign Zero is promoting? Because for a lot of people who are watching, they may be surprised that some of these things are practical and could be implemented quickly. I know just one off the top of my head that I know we can all focus on because it's been so painfully real these last few weeks. Chokeholds and strangleholds, just saying that's not what we do. You don't need that in order to effectively restrain someone. So give me what are the 8 in executive summary form so people can hear what these specific things are.
Got you. So I didn't know the first question would come to me, but the 8 things are banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation first, requiring a warning before pulling out a weapon, exhausting all alternatives for those actions, a duty of other officers to intervene. So officers can't just stand there and watch injustice happen. Banning shooting at moving vehicles. We know that keeps police and everyday citizens safe. Establishing a use of force continuum and requiring all force to be reported. And I want to be really clear. Together, those 8 things can reduce police violence by upwards of 70%. That does not stand in competition with what Philippe just walked us through. Because we know that these things can happen immediately without any executive order or act of Congress. All we need is a mayor to have the political will and courage to stand up and say, those 8 can't wait, and I will go and change the use of force standard tonight, let alone tomorrow. So do that now, and then continue to work with your community, because we will continue to keep up the pressure, I can promise you that, to make sure that we are getting to those comprehensive public safety solutions that are community-based and community-oriented and far beyond anything that we're experiencing right now that Philippe just walked us through. These don't stand in competition with imagination. These are a necessary step immediately to keep people safe as we do the hard work of making sure we get to what's.
That's great. And let me just point out, in my opening remarks, I mentioned sometimes this tension is posed between political participation and protest. Philippe's an example of why you have to participate politically, because if you are on the streets protesting and making demands, having somebody on the city council who can follow up and respond and advocate and deal with pushback and is in the room when budgets are made and is, advising mayors on how they're going to negotiate the next collective bargaining contract with the police union. You need those folks in order to ultimately deliver the goods. I'm constantly mindful of the fact that this is not an either or thing, and there's so many ways, all of which are necessary to make a difference. When Rashad talked about the cultural element of this, Dr. King, this may be apocryphal, but I think somebody mentioned to him, just having an anti-discrimination bill, an anti-lynching bill, that's not going to change hearts and minds. He says, no, it won't, but it'll maybe stop me from getting lynched. And that's important too. Now, so laws are important. On the other hand, the narrative and the stories and telling people, here, see me, I'm human, here's my pain. This is somebody's son, this is somebody's uncle. Here's the story that you need to understand about our background and our community. How do we break down stereotypes, as Eric Holder eloquently talked about? That's the work of a lot of people. So some are going to be on the streets protesting. Some are going to be running for office. Some are going to be writing. During this week, I picked up and reread The Fire Next Time. It is frightening to notice how James Baldwin can lay out a reality 50 years ago that sounds like it was written yesterday. And that's activism, that's work, that's participation. So I worry sometimes that, as we debate strategies, people start thinking there's one way of doing things. We all have a role to play, we all have a part. The more specific we are, practical, in the short term, as well as visionary in the long term, the better off we're going to be. But with that, I'm going to be quiet because you don't need to hear from more old head stuff. But I just want to say how much I appreciate all of you. And Michael, I'm assuming that the conversation is going to continue.
Yes, sir. Let me go ahead and jump in and thank Brittany for the masterful moderation and for all the wisdom and hard work that was on display. I'm now going to turn it over to our Deputy Director for Network and Partnerships at My Brother's Keeper Alliance, Nicole Fields, who's going to take a couple questions from our MBK communities. So not everyone watching has an opportunity to ask questions, but our MBK communities do. So that's another reason you should become an MBK community. So Nicole is going to pose a couple questions, but we will get you out of here by 6:30, everyone. We realize that we've been on for a while, but we will be sending resources afterwards. We've also created a Google group so we can continue this conversation there as well. So Nicole, let me bring you on to field those questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, President Obama. Really powerful conversation. Tons of great questions. Take the first question from our young people. Playon Patrick asks, this question is directed at Councilman Cunningham. How have the media's portrayal of frequent violent riots in Minneapolis affected your efforts to promote the work of protesters, activists, and elected officials pushing towards a self-sustaining public safety system?
Yes, thank you for that question, Playon. So, So, the media's portrayal of hyper-focusing on the violent protests or the violence and the rioting happening during the protest really pulls away from what is actually happening. The real story of the trauma and the pain and the reason why folks are out on the ground doing the work, why we are traumatized as a community, why we are doing this work together. So the media is looking for a sensational story and talking about the public health approach to public safety is not that sexy. So it's easier to be able to pick what's happening right now, make that newsworthy. And so what it does is it's distracting. It's distracting from the voice of the folks who are on the community, who have demands, who have a clear vision. It's distracting, it's pulling away from their voice and centering them, the folks who have been on the ground nonstop for years, some folks in their cases for decades. And so I want to make sure that I've been all over the media. I've been fortunate that folks have been reaching out all over the world, and I keep hammering home. Everybody wants to talk about the riots and, you know, the violence and you know, everything that's happening, but I always redirect it back to it is possible for us to build alternative systems to public safety outside of policing. It requires political will, it requires investment, and we are already doing it and it works. And so trying to constantly bring it back to that is really what I think it's important, that we have messengers who have the platforms, the bully pulpits, as we say in politics, have those platforms to be able to speak that. We have to keep pushing it and not let media distract us from really the point, which is justice.
Thank you, Councilmember. Great, well said. The next question actually was asked, a few folks asked this same exact question, and I think any one of our panelists can take this. What advice can you give to mayors to honor protesters' demands for more police accountability and less brutal and racist practices while supporting their police force and maintaining broad public confidence? Folks have been asking, how do we change these accountability measures while also confronting police unions who have invested in our elected officials?
You know, I'm going to take a stab at something just because I think it's illustrative. It doesn't answer the entire question. When I was in the state legislature back in Illinois, we passed one of the first, if not the first, laws dealing with racial profiling in traffic stops. And there was no way to get that passed without support of the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, the primary organization of the police unions. And the argument I was able to make to them was that police officers are going to be safer if there is greater trust and less tension, that they will be able to do their jobs better if they have data that has been collected, that is clear, and police chiefs are going to be able to manage their forces more effectively. They will be less distracted by things that don't require an armed response, and they can refocus attention in ways that are good for them as well as the community. And it took a long time to make that argument, and I'm sure that there are rank and file members who didn't believe it. But in fact, after we passed it, we started being able to collect data on that issue, and we were able to get them to go along. Now, how responsive the police union is going to be in any circumstance, you know, it's going to go city by city, and it's not easy. But I guess the point I am making, and Eric Holder, if he's still on, may want to chime in on this. I do think there is police leadership that recognizes the need for change. But changing culture is hard. And sometimes the dynamics within the unions themselves are difficult. And, you know, and sometimes there's that sense of we need to close ranks even though we know some things are messed up. And so finding ways to listen and recognize that they have a tough job, but also then insist that this is what we need to do. We're going to do it. We'll work with you to figure out how to do it. So when Brittany talked about the 8 can't wait, you should have a dialogue to find out what specific things are a problem with not having to choke somebody, particularly when they're already in handcuffs. What is it that you think is a problem? When you force people to articulate what it is that they object to with reasonable demands of the sort that have been outlined, a lot of times they come up empty. But you have to engage in that conversation. And I think that it's possible to get that done. At the end of the day, though, if you don't have the political pressure to do it, they will resist. Just because the status quo always resists without some pressure. And that's why it's so important, both for the protests and for the follow-up that people like Councilman Cunningham can apply.
General, Mr. President, before we wrap up, any final words?
No, just keep working and stay hopeful. As I said, this is a moment, and we've had moments like this before, where people are paying attention. And that doesn't mean that everything will get solved. And so don't get disheartened, because there's a marathon, not a sprint. But the fact that people are paying attention provides an opportunity to educate, activate, mobilize, and act. And I hope that we are able to seize this moment. I hope the mayors across the country who have either been watching or hear about this take that pledge to start immediately implementing some steps that can make a difference. And I hope all the young people who've been inspired and engaged and involved, they keep at it, because that's what ultimately is going to create the kind of country we want. And for those who have been talking about protests, just remember, this country was founded on protest. It is called the American Revolution. And every step of progress in this country, every expansion of freedom, every expression of our deepest ideals has been won through efforts that made the status quo uncomfortable. And we should all be thankful for folks who are willing in a peaceful, disciplined way to be out there making a difference. So thank you so much, everybody. Proud of you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I encourage all of you to go to obama.org. Go to obama.org if you're a mayor, take the pledge. If you're looking to become an MBK community, if you're looking for places to donate or resources, or just to join the Alliance, go to obama.org. We will continue to be there for you, with you. Our partners at the Leadership Conference mayors are excited to provide technical assistance for you as you think about reading those use of force policies, as well as our broader partner network. So this is just the beginning of a conversation. We'll continue this in many different ways, and also be on the lookout for our next town hall that will be coming up, as well as some other actions. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Thank you, Councilman Cunningham. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Rashad Robinson. Thank you to all of our MBK communities for the extraordinary work you do every day on behalf of our boys and young men of color and our sisters. And thank you to all of our young men and all of our young women for everything that you do, not just to be the future, but to be the change today. Have a great day, everybody.